many of you know, there were witch hunts in Europe, which coincided with the Inquisition and beyond. And although these experiences were greatly informed the events in New England, we are focusing very specifically on the experience within the Puritan world in early America. So what actually, in fact, is a witch hunt? In the literal sense, it is just that: the search for and the subsequent persecution of a supposed witch. To fully understand the witch hunts and why people believed in witches, we have to understand the mindset of the day. Magic, religion, and science were conflated. It was heresy to disbelieve in magic and witches. Everyone believed. And Puritans were especially preoccupied with the notion of sin and that the devil was ever present in daily life, tempting mostly women into sin and acts of heresy. Women's position within the Puritan world was highly and harshly regulated. Church attendance was mandatory. Absence was a punishable crime. Life in the colonies was harsh and difficult, and natural phenomena was scary. Crops failed, children died, food rotted, animals died. There were terrifying storms, hail, plagues of diseases. And when these things happened, it was not a matter of why tragedy or misfortune had come, but who had actually caused it. There were two types of magic considered in witchcraft. Sort of the run-of-the-mill bad magic, or maleficium, which was the type that caused crops to fail or an animal to die, and this was to be mean or to get revenge on a neighbor. And the second, more diabolical kind, involved a subordination to and working with the devil for the purpose of evil intent, and to subvert God and all earthly goodness, which was punishable by death. So who was accused of witchcraft? More often than not, women. 40 to 60 years of age generally, who were somehow vulnerable within society, either through their age, lack of male protection, widows, unmarried women, childless women, and who were somehow disruptive to the status quo, being outsiders to the community. Many were healers or midwives, women who had knowledge beyond what others thought they possibly should have had. When women were intelligent, outspoken, less inclined to join or attend church, they became suspect. An accusation could be easily made, supplying herbs to someone to heal them. If the herbs work too well, they may be accused of knowledge beyond what was proper. If the herbs didn't work and the person died, well, the healer could be accused of making the person sicker or even causing their death. Once an accusation was made, the evidence was compiled, the testimony of others as to their experiences and claims against the witch. The person was searched for a witch's mark, believed to be a teat by which the accused suckled her familiar, an animal or spirit purported to work with the witch. Any mark would do: a skin tag, a birthmark, a mole. Another witch test was dunking, which involved binding a person and throwing them into water. If she floated, she was a witch. If she sunk, she was innocent. Now, there was some effort to retrieve people who sunk, but more often than not, it resulted in death. Now, the reason that they believed that water would purge the witch was because witches were thought to have, had spurned the rite of baptism, thus the water would expel them. Of course, the accused was prodded to confess his or her sins in a variety of ways, including being poked by red-hot pincers, thumb screws, familiar with the term, turning the screws. This was, in essence, a vice, smashing one's fingers as it closed. Waterboarding, pouring of water down the throats of accused witches, and of course, the practice of strappado, in which the accused's hands were tied behind their back, a rope tied around the hands, and then hoisted on a lever to a height, and then repeatedly dropped until their shoulders either dislocated or broke. This was, as one can imagine, excruciating.
I was looking for my book, for my talk, and I didn't think I could find it, so I went back and got another one. Guess where my book is? Right here. All right. Yeah. Did you have trouble parking?
Yes.
Yeah, somebody should have put a spell on the opera. Their fault. Okay, wait a minute now. Okay, all right. Loretta will not be, even though Loretta Orion will not be speaking today, rest assured that everything you hear has come from the mouth, from the pen, and from the research that Loretta has done. Okay. So here we are. It's the 1650s. Okay? We have not yet become the upscale, fashionable, trendy, and unaffordable Hamptons. However, the settlement is royal. Men had just as much or possibly or more difficulty getting along with one another as the town's women. Men redressed their grievances with that good old staple of East Hampton history, the lawsuit. Between 1650 and 1656, the magistrates recorded more than 34 court cases dealing with matters such as trespass, damage to crops, ownership disputes, overcharging in business transactions. Sound familiar? Disagreements over land boundaries. Nearly half the cases involved slander and defamation. Highlights of these cases included the accusation that a servant stood behind Mrs. Gardner and made bow wow noise. The Reverend Mr. Thomas James accused a man of attempting to seduce both his daughter and his maid. 4 men, you ready for this one? We're not making this up now. 4 men, including Goody Davis's husband, were accused of being notorious masturbators. It's in the town record. One of them was named Hand. This was a capital offense, punishable by death. For the first time, the East Hampton magistrates called on the expertise of an external court. Only after extended examination of the witnesses and serious debate and consultation with the authorities in Connecticut did the townsmen decide the offense was not worthy of the loss of life or limb. In the year 1656, preceding the Goody Garlic witchcraft case, 15 cases came before the magistrates. That is 1 case for every 12 persons in the town. In the year preceding the Goody Garlic trial, these public interpersonal conflicts escalated to the point of overburdening the court. The townsmen passed a series of ordinances to discourage this contentious behavior. These have the tone of the Old Testament, an eye for an eye. Anyone who brought charges against another must be prepared to suffer the same loss of life or limb or goods that he would have done to his neighbor if the charges were proven false. So any man who struck up another in anger would pay a fine to the court, and pay a fine for his victim's cure as well as productive labor lost as a result of the injuries. A fine of up to £5 would be imposed for slander. Okay, it's February 1657. Groundhog Day has already happened. Okay? It's cold, it's dark, it stinks. In the midst of all this whirlwind of contention, a sudden illness came upon Elizabeth Howell, Lion Gardener's daughter, one evening in February 1657. Elizabeth, who was then 16 years old, had recently given birth to her first child. She was alone at home until a friend, Samuel Parsons, came to visit her husband, Arthur Howell. He was not at home, she told him. However, Elizabeth invited her guest to warm himself at the fire. She confided that she was suffering from a headache and that she thought that she had caught a chill. Samuel left for a short while, then returned to find her worse. Elizabeth bound a cloth around her head to ease her pain. Presently, Elizabeth's husband returned home with a friend, William Russell. They found Elizabeth huddled by the fire. She said, "Love, I am very ill in my head, and I feel I shall have the fever." Arthur took her to bed. "Lord, have mercy upon me," she sobbed, and then asked for her friends to pray for her. Elizabeth prayed herself that she would not lose her senses. Shortly thereafter, she said, as she suckled her baby, "My poor child, it pities me for thee than for myself, for if I be ill, to be sure thou wilt be too." After the baby was taken from her, Elizabeth sang the words of a psalm and then terrified her friends by shrieking, "A witch! A witch! Now you'll come to torture me because I spoke 2 or 3 words against you? In the morning you will come fawning." As Samuel Parsons said, "The Lord be merciful. It'd be well if she's not bewitched." Okay, thank you for coming. No, there's more. Go ahead, Amy. Tell them some more, Amy.
The men were reluctant to disturb Lion Gardner with the health of his daughter because he was attending his wife, who was also quite ill. Finally, they sent Samuel Parsons to inform Lion Gardner of his daughter's condition. Lion found his daughter peering fixedly at the foot of her bed, screeching, "A witch! A witch!" He asked her, "What do you see?" "A black thing at the bed's feet," she answered, sobbing and flailing to fight an adversary that she alone could see. But she resisted him with uncharacteristic strength. At last, she had exhausted herself. The next morning, Lion Gardner found that his daughter's condition deteriorated. He decided to inform his wife. After several failed attempts to rise her from her own sickbed, Mary Gardner struggled across the village green to the bedside of her daughter. Daughter and mother wept in each other's arms until Elizabeth said, "Oh, mother, I am bewitched." Mary, now startled, said, "No, no, you are asleep or dreaming." But Elizabeth insisted, "I am not asleep. I am not dreaming. Truly, I am bewitched." Mary asked her, "Whom do you see?" After some hesitation, at last Elizabeth shrieked, "Goody Garlic, Goody Garlic! I see her at the far corner of the bed, and a black thing of hers at the corner."
The earliest evidence we have for local suspicion that Goody Elizabeth Garlic, the wife of Joshua Garlic, by the way, Goody's not a name. It's a title, like Good Wife and Goodman. We didn't explain that at the beginning of the book. I'm sorry. So everybody's not named Goody. It's a shortness for Good Wife. All right. The earliest evidence we have for local suspicion that Goody Elizabeth Garlic, the wife of Joshua Garlic, was a witch, came from Goody Simon's memory of a strange thing that happened one day when she was having her seizures. On the day of her seizures, Goody Bishop hurried down the main street of East Hampton with some dockweed that she got from Goody Garlic to ease Goody Simon's fits. When Goody Bishop arrived at Goody Simon's house, the ailing woman recoiled in horror and threw the herbs into the fire. When she and Goody Davis burned the herbs, Simons explained that it had been like this on another day, when she and several of the people who came to East Hampton were still living in Lynn, Massachusetts. On that occasion, also, a friend brought healing herbs to ease her fits. Then a strange black thing entered the house. While Goody Simons was in the throes of a strong fit, her neighbor asked, "Who has a black cat?" Another answered, "Dennis Babizak." "Oh, no, no." Goody Garlic. Sorry.
Mary Gardner was obliged to return to her own house and bed. That day, three neighbors, Goody Birdsall, Ann Edwards, and Goody Simons, stood by as Elizabeth's afflictions intensified. She alternated between long periods of incoherence and clear and violent outcries. "She is a double-tongued woman. She pricks me with pins. Oh, she torments me." "Who torments you?" the women asked. At first, Elizabeth was reluctant to reply, but finally she screamed, "Ah, Garlic! You jeered me when I came to your house to call my husband. You laughed and jeered me, and I went away crying." Elizabeth continued to rant. "Oh, you are a pretty one. Send for Garlic and his wife," she cried out. "I would tear her in pieces and leave the birds to pick her bones." She answered the women, who wondered why she would do such a thing. "Did you not see her last night stand by my bedside, ready to pull me to pieces? She pricked me with pins. She brought a black thing to the foot of my bed." Then, clutching her throat, Elizabeth gagged and choked. Ann Edwards forced Elizabeth's mouth open with the handle of a knife. Finding no obstruction, Ann next gave her some oil and sugar, which was commonly thought to be a remedy against witchcraft. After a brief calm, Elizabeth coughed, and her attendant saw a pin fall from her mouth. Simons retrieved the pin and held it to the light. There had been no such pin in the house before. Elizabeth, parched by fever, coughed and sobbed, clutched her head and her throat, and descended deeper and deeper into delirium, surfacing now and then to give voice to her torment. "Garlic, double-tongued, ugly things and pins." And she called out for her mother until she finally
Hey,
grew
Amy,
quiet
that's enough. That's
and
enough.
tormented
That's
her with
enough.
death.
Jeez. What a downer.
He gets to be the funny one. I always have to be the serious
That's
one.
right, Amy. They take that, okay? All right, well, what happened? Dennis, they don't know. Raise the price of the book. Well, there are a lot of questions, of course, that still have to be answered. For example, do you know this story that you just heard took place 5 doors down the street? Did you know that? To the west? That's the spot where Elizabeth and Arthur Howell lived. Mr. James, are you here? He is. Don't go down there. He's taking names. Okay? All right. All right. I mean, what happened? What happened to the baby? What happened to Elizabeth Garlick? Do you know that Lyon Gardner, there's no written evidence of Lyon Gardner, the father, who was in the house, of him saying anything about this case at all to anybody? Why was it important, very important to this story, that John Winthrop Jr. was actually the governor of Connecticut at that time? What happened to Arthur Howell? What happened to all the other witnesses? And what could she have died from? Well, many of those questions we'll let you ask, or we'll try to answer. We can't answer all of them. Otherwise, you won't be able to read the book. Okay. Let me just tell you how we got here, and then we'll have time for questions, okay? First of all, the first draft, the first manuscript that we blew out went to Dr. David Hicks of the anthropology department at Stony Brook University. Dr. Hicks was Loretta's dissertation advisor when she got her doctorate. And you have to be careful what you ask for, because we were getting questions like, who are these people? Why is this important? You already said this. Can't you say this another way? And besides all that, because Dr. Hicks, of course, has written over 5 books and many articles, we also realized something else. He had an advantage that we never thought of. He wasn't cognizant of East Hampton history. So we were getting questions, goody who? The Eastern Plain, what are earmarks for? And it made us realize that we were writing the book not just for people from East Hampton. Then, of course, no book about East Hampton history cannot be completed without going through the lens of Richard Barons, the former director of the East Hampton Historical Society and the senior curator. And Richard was going through the manuscript aided by the proofreader extraordinaire, Isabel Carmichael. So after they got done beating it up, Isabel retyped the entire manuscript. Actually, we got Richard to read it twice. He doesn't know that, but we tricked him into reading it twice. Okay. Now, where did all these changes go? Every time we made a change, we had to get it back from Dr. Hicks. We got to get it back from Richard and Isabel. It went to 631-324-0405. Mary Krogan at the East Hampton Business Service. And you know what Mary Krogan's man, is she here? There she is, all right. Yeah. Mary's mantra is no problem. No matter what you bring there, it's no problem. Now, we're not going to have footnotes in the main part of the book. They're going to be endnotes, no problem. Here are 5 more additions to the bibliography. Now it's not in alphabetical, no problem. And now the endnotes, no problem. And the reason we were lucky that Mary was in a good mood is because the Red Sox won the World Series. Okay. Now, I definitely have to thank Dennis and the board of the library for pushing this book forward the way you did, because now my wife Loretta can enjoy it. And that was very, very important that you've done that. And I can't thank you enough. Now, after all the additions, subtractions, corrections, then it goes to the great Gina Piasek of the Long Island Room. Now, besides her own editing skills, Gina went on a treasure hunt. And she found images to put in the book. And so many of the images are even close to the time period, but they also fit in with the text. So that was great. Catherine Tremblay cannot be here today. Catherine spent one winter with Loretta working on the book, organizing the files, creating something called a Dropbox. Right? Yeah, well, we never heard of that before. We did. And then we have Amy. Now, Amy is the reason you become a teacher, okay? Aimee was in my 3rd grade class, my 4th grade class, my gifted and talented class, and in every theater production that I directed at Spring School, she had a major part, including Fagin and Oliver. She also would come over after work here in East Hampton and spend 2 hours working on Loretta's files. She also went to gatherings with Loretta when Loretta was doing her research before she got her doctorate. And when Richard, the last lecture of the library's Tom Toomey series was the Gardner Legacy, and Richard Barron said that one of the most underreported figures of the 17th century was Lyon Gardner. So we're bullying Aimee now into writing a book about Lyon Gardner. Okay. And then there's Loretta. Okay? Now, many of you know Loretta as the landscape gardener at Home Sweet Home Museum. No, that's not who Loretta has been. Okay? Loretta Orion received her doctorate of philosophy from the Department of Anthropology at the State University of New York at Stony Brook in 1990. She has taught anthropology, sociology, and medical anthropology at Long Island University, Hofstra University, Suffolk County Community College, and St. John's University. Loretta's research skills, that's why that garden looked the way it did at Home Sweet Home. There was no accident that garden looked the way it did. It's because Loretta set her mind to it. Her book, Never Again, The Burning Times, Paganism Revived, was published in 1995 by Waveland Press. She lives in Amagansett. Well, we know that. Okay. She lives in Amagansett. All right, Aimee, you want to do something?
Sure.
Okay. Well, let me do one more.
Oh, no.
Okay. Why did Loretta write this book? That's what somebody's going to ask, I'm sure. This is what Loretta writes, I became interested in the Goody Garlic witchcraft case in East Hampton after I began research about the neo-pagan or Wiccan movement in the United States for my doctoral dissertation at Stony Brook University. The neo-pagans could consider themselves modern witches, but not of the variety with broomsticks and black cats. Researching the history of witchcraft throughout Europe and the Americas revealed the horrors of torture, hangings, burnings at the stake, and other indignities imposed on mostly women who were accused of witchcraft. I began to wonder how a story of witchcraft had played out in East Hampton in 1657, how the story either paralleled the witchcraft hysteria in Europe and New England, or how a different outcome was realized in East Hampton. The Goody Garlic witchcraft case is relevant to our times because the story and other witchcraft cases mentioned in my book highlight how the act of dehumanizing people can lead society to inflict awful treatment on those individuals because they are not considered human and therefore must be evil. Sound familiar? World history reveals the horrifying treatment of Africans, Native Americans, and the Jews of Europe, among others. Today, Muslims and Latin Americans are thought to be out of the mainstream of our society and thus not deserving of the constitutional liberties enjoyed by American citizens. Finally, the Goody Garlic story is important because of its unusual outcome, influenced by the character and history of two of the major participants in the story. Lyon Gardner, the father of the young girl who died screaming she was being bewitched, and the judge of the trial in Connecticut, John Winthrop Jr. You have something?
Good.
We're good? Okay.
You covered it all.
Oh, I did. I covered it all.
Now they're
Thank
not
you.
going to buy the book. Yeah.
Okay, now they're not going to buy the book. Okay. See, that's only half an hour. Okay, now you can ask questions, make comments. We can answer some of the other questions that we've asked if you want. Ah, good question.
Because Long Island was actually part of the Connecticut colony at that time. So, and when this happened, as you can imagine, nobody in East Hampton wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. It was way out of their purview. I mean, they didn't want to deal with the notorious masturbators, let alone a witch.
Right.
So, he was my teacher. That's why they ended up going to Connecticut, which actually was probably what ultimately saved Goody Garlic's life because of John Winthrop Jr. and how he felt about witchcraft. And the story itself is relevant not only to history, but it's also relevant to the way that people who were accused of witchcraft in the Connecticut colony were treated. In that time frame, I think looking through Damos's book, we found, aside from Salem, in which approximately 200 people were accused, 20 people ended up being executed. 13 of whom were women, seven of whom were men. But in that time period, we're talking probably somewhere in the realm of maybe 400 to 600 accusations. Now, just an accusation wasn't necessarily enough to, take it to fruition to an execution, but tellingly, of all of those accusations, the number of women is about 135 that we know of who were accused, and there was some form of magisterial accompaniment. There were about 35 men who were accused and who then had depositions taken against them, many of whom were not executed. But I think they were somewhere in the realm of about 50 plus people who were executed during the time. But this did harken a time where people did not take the accusation of witchcraft to immediately mean that someone was in league with the devil and or that they must be executed.
Yeah, there were the other part of that question is that the magistrates in East Hampton really had no experience with this at all. They didn't want to touch it. And do you know why we think that she may have gotten off? There are two kinds of evidence. The first kind was maleficium, where you do harmful magic. You hurt somebody's crops. You cause one of their animals to die. You have a baby sicken. But the other evidence was conspiracy with Satan. And John Winthrop Jr., because he was an educated man, because he was a philosopher, he dealt in magic and the occult, he did not think that normal people could conspire with Satan, or they could do this magic that they were supposed to be doing. And that was one of the saviors. John Winthrop Jr. also was interested in keeping communities together, because once you had a witchcraft accusation in a community, it could tear it apart. Well, he wasn't interested in that. Remember, he was almost forced to come there to be governor. He wasn't interested in being the governor at all. In fact, he didn't show up for a while. He finally got there. So he was not interested in all. Also, he wanted to keep, I think, the community in Connecticut, in East Hampton, glued to Connecticut. This was a cash cow over here with all the animals that we had, too, don't forget. And you didn't want the Dutch coming out here. So it was in his best interest to keep the people in East Hampton happy. And when you read the charge he sent, when he sent Elizabeth Garlick back, he said that she needed to go peaceably with the people in East Hampton, and they needed to do the same, you see. And that was the charge. But he did say this: you had just suspicions. But you see, he was still playing up to the people in East Hampton. He was very fortunate, yes. Besides, this is the other reason the story is unusual. Not only did the Garlicks come back, Mr. Garlick lived to be 100, and we think Elizabeth Garlick lived pretty much the same. We can't find any record of her death in the town records. And they prospered. Their son became the miller. That was a pretty important position in the town. No, I don't know. Well, I mean, we have roots in England here. I mean, the people came from New England, so maybe. I don't know.
Well, Town Pond didn't exist then. No.
It wasn't dug out.
It wasn't dug out at that time. So, well, it wasn't, was she, taken into the square and flogged? No. Or at least there's certainly no record of that. Was there a public dunking somewhere? Did they haul her off to Hook Pond? Not that we're aware of. There was no evidence to suggest that any of those things happened, but these were fairly typical of the kinds of things that people did to prove that someone was a witch within the Puritan colonies.
There is speculation.
Unfortunately, we don't have a record. As much as we don't have a record of everything that transpired at that time, but it is striking that there is absolute silence. We do have the testimony of other people during the inquest, which is interesting. The common folk who were the accusers, Goody Birdsall, Goody Simons, all of these women had various things to contribute to the accusation. But yes. Yes. Well, this is an interesting point, though, too, because women's roles at that point were so regulated, so highly controlled, women did not have recourse to go and start a lawsuit in court like men did. So women mitigated their issues through gossip. So there was a lot of sort of, navigation through these times through what you could say about a person's character, how you could demean a person in that way. And so when women feel powerless, this is the way that they create power for themselves and mitigate their disagreements. Lion Gardner, to get back to the original part of it, though we don't have a record to that, we can perhaps infer from what we do know about him that he, like John Winthrop Jr., being an educated man, being a man who spent about 15 years in the Netherlands during the 30 Years' War, who worked his way up from being a pikeman to being an engineer of fortifications, which is how he actually came to Saybrook. He was hired to build the fort of Old Saybrook. So he had a different idea about what was important and what he thought people were capable of. Again, we don't have anything to say he didn't say anything or he did.
The Lion Gardner married a Dutch woman. He lived in the Netherlands for 15 to 20 years. The Dutch were very different than the Puritans. In the Puritans, if you were born a certain place, that's it. You stayed. You're not moving. But the Dutch were more interested in your business acumen. And you could move in the Dutch culture. The Dutch also were very tolerant of other religions. It became like a melting pot in many places. So he was exposed to that culture. He was also exposed to the horrors of the 30 Years' War. It was awful. And maybe he had seen enough. Those are two of the reasons why we think he may have been silent. He also could have been, it could have been stricken from the record. Maybe he didn't want his testimony because he was in the house when she was having her problem. So he should have been called at the hearing in East Hampton. But he was Lion Gardner. So maybe he didn't want to be heard and to talk it. She was deemed not innocent, but he had to post her bond for her good behavior, and they moved. They moved to City Island, which is now City Island. And there's one line in the Southampton Town records, but I couldn't find it. There's one line that has one sentence that has the word witchcraft in it, but I didn't think it meant that. It didn't mean that there was a case. And then I went back and looked, and I couldn't find it. So that's all we know.
Just go back to what you said.
Well, not nonsense. You were supposed to believe. Winthrop never believed that normal people could do any of this magic. Only people like him could do it. Yeah. I don't know. We don't know. You're getting into the head of Lion Gardner. I don't know. This case was John Winthrop's first witchcraft case. And then when he went back to England, they stopped when he got there. They come to a halt when he was the governor. But let me tell you something else we just learned. When you had a trial, there was the judge, and Winthrop Jr. was the judge. But then there were the magistrates, like 7 of those. Then there was the jury. So you weren't allowed a defense attorney. So the only person who could really take care of you was the judge, who would be trying to confuse you enough so you would confess. So then they would have the evidence. But the magistrates also got involved in the case. And out of the 7 magistrates that were there for the Goody Garlic case, 4 of them had been in other trials where the person was convicted. And then I found out that once the jury rendered the verdict, if the magistrates didn't like it, they would overturn it. So you can see what a precarious position she was in. And if you beat that and you come back to East Hampton, you got to feel pretty good about yourself. I'm not saying that. You were going to, yeah. So Winthrop leaves, goes back to England. The cases start up again. And then when he comes back, they stop again. So yes, he was not a big fan of this. You didn't need it. People couldn't do this. It hurt the whole settlement. So she was very fortunate. And remember, if he was the judge today, he would have to recuse himself. Conflicts of interest. He knew Lion Gardner. And Lion Gardner traded goods or got goods to John Winthrop Jr.? Who brought them over there? Joshua Garlick. So he knew both of them. They were elected. They were elected.
They were like a town board?
Yes, exactly. They were the three men. Thomas Baker, John Hand, and John Mulford were the three magistrates at this time.
And they could override just about anything.
No, well, wait a minute now. We're talking about two different things here. In East Hampton, they ran the town meeting.
You mentioned the magistrate.
That's at the trial in England, in New England. When there was a trial over there, you had the judge, but then you had these magistrates, and then you had the jury. So it was a three-tiered system, I
They
found
were
it.
still elected, are we on the same page?
I'm assuming that we were elected, yes, the magistrates. Or the governor appointed them. I'm not sure. That's a good question. No, that was 1692. This is way before the Salem witch trials. And you know, the reason that this case is different, too, that women are appearing in the town records. You don't see women, the only time women appear in the town records is if they do something to bother their husband. See? If a woman does something and it reflects on the husband, then they appear in the town records. Otherwise, they're wiped away. And you know, the other thing, the magistrates probably weren't too interested here in East Hampton. These women's, this is gossip, this is innuendo, you know, why bother? But then it turned into witchcraft. Well, then they had to get rid of it. They had to send it over to Connecticut. Yes. Which Richard has also said that belies the idea that we were this isolated little place way out there on the East End. We were not. You know, there's plenty of evidence. There were Northwest Harbor was an important harbor. Sag Harbor, well, it was later. Yes?
Which house down the road here?
Well, ask the guy sitting behind you. I think we figured out about 187 people in 1657. Many of them were young. Goody Garlick, we think, was older. And remember, here's the other beauty. She was a healer. I mean, she purported to be a healer. She would give you something. Well, guess what happened? If you gave somebody something to make them feel better and they died, who gets blamed? Right? That's what happens.
And we know she was not a particularly pleasant woman,
Yeah, right.
which probably made her more of a target. And there is some evidence to suggest that she may have been of French Huguenot extraction, and therefore outside of Puritanism, which would also have made her a target.
Yeah, there were only two people in East Hampton we know of who were not English. It was, we think, Goody Garlick is one, and Mary Gardner was Dutch.
That's the question we've been waiting to hear. Well, her baby lived, and thank goodness that she did, because I wouldn't be here, and neither would my cousin. Which is part of the reason that this story is important to me, not only because of the rich history of this town from which I am, but also it is part of my family history. So what happens to young women who give birth in these days? We know we have high infant and mother mortality rates, right? Does anybody have any idea what might happen when someone with really filthy hands might deliver a baby? Right. There is a condition called puerperal fever.
Purple.
Puerperal,
Puerperal
excuse me,
fever.
puerperal fever.
I'm still the teacher.
And the symptoms are very much what Elizabeth describes. The very high fever resulting in hallucinations, and the feeling of being pricked with pins and being torn apart. I mean, if anybody's had a really bad flu or a bad infection, you know how miserable it feels. Imagine that times 100. So this 16-year-old girl who had just given birth was going through this, and she knew Goody Garlick. She knew her whole life. You know, Goody Garlick lived on the island when she was growing up. So this is a woman that she'd known her whole life, and somebody who, again, was not a particularly pleasant person. She was a bit of a know-it-all. She was very brash. She was very rebellious. She had no problem sharing what was on her mind. Nobody particularly liked her. So she was kind of the perfect scapegoat, really. And being this young woman in the throes of this absolute hysteria and suffering in this way, it kind of makes sense when you put all these things together that this would be the person that she would accuse and why she would have been accused.
Yes, Goody Garlic delivered the baby.
And we don't know if that's true or not, but it's also a possibility. Maybe she did deliver the baby because she was a midwife and healer. Correct. Correct. There's a little bit of, history tends to be mythologized quite a lot, especially when we don't have all the information. And there were some sort of, myths that Lion Gardner saved the day and, Goody Garlic lived out the rest of her life on the island and all these things. That didn't happen. But what did happen was that Joshua Garlic and Goody Garlic were tenant farmers who worked for Lion Gardner on Gardner's Island, and they moved to East Hampton pretty much at the same time as Lion Gardner did. And so they were well known, as Hugh said. Joshua Garlic was his emissary and did trade with Connecticut, very specifically with John Winthrop Jr. So they were all known to one another. These people were not strangers. We know today it's a pretty small town. Imagine how much smaller it was then.
Yeah.
No, I don't think there was any, there was allegedly an incident where Goody Garlic sort of teased her in a not very nice way about being young and inexperienced and having to kind of call her husband home. But aside from that, I don't think that, or certainly there's no indication that Goody Garlic was in any way persecuting her or especially going after her. She just was an unpleasant person who sort of treated everybody like that.
I got two, I just want to say, we'll get your question in a minute. First of all, this is my mistake. I tried to blame Gina for it, but I couldn't. The photo in the back of the book was done by our friend Evan Thomas, and I did not put a notation in there. So Evan's photo now has been appearing in all the newspapers with no attribution. So I wanted to let everybody know today that this photo in the back was done by Evan. If you don't like it, there he is, right over there. And the other thing I'm going to say is, this is Carlton Kelsey's hat. All right? You know who Carlton Kelsey was, right? He was one of the many historians who kept history alive in our town before the rest of us caught up. There was Henry Hedges, there was Jeanette Edwards Rattray, and the great N. Sherrill Foster, and Carlton. And they were doing this long before everyone realized how important it was. All right, you have a question in the back, yes? I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. Walter Wood, oh, wait a minute. I didn't say this. Where's LT? There he is. If you want to find out more about what the government of East Hampton was like in 1657, LTV taped the Goody Garlic Conference that Richard Barons organized in September of 2015. And Richard invited Dan Cohen, Mr. Cohen, to give you an overview of what this government was like. And then there's Loretta's story on the tape. And then at the end, Richard invited the Connecticut State Historian, Walter Woodward, here. And he took us through the witchcraft hysteria in New England. So if you can pull up that tape on the archives of LTV and you can watch that whole thing. Also, I would suggest that if you're really interested in the witchcraft hysteria in New England, you read Damos's, John Putnam Damos, Entertaining Satan. And the reason why I mentioned these pins, there was a case right after the Goody Garlic case that the woman testified that she was being pricked with pins. And Walter Woodward, the Connecticut State Historian, thinks they got the idea from the case here in East Hampton that went to Connecticut, that the Goody Garlic case was one of the first cases where there's pins. And then if you go to Salem, I guess they have them all over the museum. In the museums, all these pins that were supposed to have come up. But that's all we know.
That's actually, it's kind of a coincidental, I think. That actually has a lot more to do with other sort of like hoodoo practices and things like that. It wasn't necessarily something specific to witchcraft per se. Witches often were purported to use poppets to bewitch people with. So it would be a small rag doll that one would fashion, and maybe there was some notion that, in Salem, we have Tituba, who was a slave from Barbados, who probably had some experience with other kinds of magic beliefs, and may have helped insert that in that particular case. In this case, it was Anne Edwards who lay with Elizabeth Howell while she was going through her hysteria, and she stayed with her, and she slept in the bed with her. Did Anne produce the pin? We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know where this pin came from. We don't know where the idea of the pin came from, but could she have done that to further, the evidence, the mounting evidence against Goody Garlic? It's possible. And could it have been done out of fear, possibly? Could it be done because she just didn't like Goody Garlic and she thought she was a horrible human being? Possibly. We don't know.
Any old business?
Any new business?
Well, I think you saw enough, you heard enough.